Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Listen to AM 560 The Answer online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560 The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Over the weekend, Jens Stoltenberg, who's the NATO Secretary General, was on one of the talk shows. Was it this week? I don't remember. What's the difference? They're all the same.
Yeah.
The hosts are interchangeable. The shows are interchangeable. But Stoltenberg was asked about NATO membership for Ukraine. Should NATO have admitted Ukraine after it applied in 2008, essentially would and could that have prevented Russia's invasion? First, Zelensky, his criticism of Ukraine, his criticism of NATO.
Today I asked the 27 leaders of Europe whether Ukraine will be in NATO. I asked directly. Everyone is afraid, does not answer. And we are not afraid. We are not afraid of anything.
Jens Stoltenberg as to the question of should NATO have admitted Ukraine?
We have supported their efforts to move towards NATO membership to help them modernize the defense and security institutions, to meet the NATO standards, to fight corruption. But at the end of the day, we need consensus, 30 allies to agree. That's the way we make decisions in NATO. And our message to Russia is that it is for Ukraine to decide whether they aspire for membership, and it's for 30 allies to assess when and if Ukraine meets those standards. As long as Ukraine is not a member, they will remain a very highly valued and close partner, and a partner that we will continue to support.
Yeah, that's a very nice process answer, which is what you'd expect from the Secretary General. But the question is really, should America have pushed for Ukraine's membership in NATO? Would that have, rather than holding Ukraine out and saying, Putin, don't do anything because we could always admit them, even as he took Crimea in 2014, maybe moving that red line that NATO draws closer to Putin would have inhibited the invasion that he has now launched? It's a question. Yeah. To help us answer it, somebody with more expertise in the area than I certainly have, Jed Babbin's a former United States Deputy Undersecretary of Defense. He's also a contributor to the Washington Times and the American Spectator. Jed, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Oh, good morning, guys.
So what about that? What about the question as to whether or not it was a mistake to leave Ukraine out of NATO over the past decade plus?
Yeah, I think it was. I think the fact that we let so many other of the nations around Russia in, Latvia, Baltimore, Lithuania, Estonia, and just to mention a few, I mean, we really have left Ukraine down. However, if you look back to what goes on from 2014 until now, you really see that if Putin is, as we believe, as paranoid about Ukraine as he is about NATO, that might have triggered the invasion even sooner. Who knows? I mean, before NATO could accept Ukraine, the time between Ukraine began its admission process and it was actually accepted, that would have been a time for Putin to invade.
So what does it mean now that the Ukraine has joined the EU?
Well, I don't think it means anything. It means that they'd be trading with the EU, but I think in terms of defense, it really doesn't mean anything. What does mean a great deal, Amy, is that some of the EU nations, even Germany now, has done a 180-degree turn. It's sending weapons to Ukraine. It's increasing its defense spending. I mean, for heaven's sake, we've seen the Swiss, who are neutral, basically say we're going to sanction Russia's oligarchs by attaching their money, and they're not going to let them use it. So this is a huge sea change in Europe, and I think it's all for the better at this point.
But so yesterday we saw this 40-mile convoy of Russian forces moving to encircle Kyiv. We get word that, not surprisingly, that Lukashenko in Belarus is going to join the fight on behalf of Putin. This is not to in any way denigrate the valiant effort being put forward by the Ukrainian people, but is anything occurring that changes in your mind or jeopardizes, potentially calls into question how this is going to end? Is this going to end in any fashion other than Russia's de facto control of Ukraine?
I think not, but I don't think Russian victory is inevitable. I'm astonished, frankly, that Ukrainian ground and air forces have been able to prevent Russia from establishing air supremacy in 5, almost 6 days of war. I think that is an amazing accomplishment by them, and it means that things are certainly up for grabs there. The real question is, how are they going to continue to be able to maintain some air presence, and whether or not their ground forces continue to be able to thwart what the Russian tactics are. I mean, right now we're seeing the Russians allegedly commit a vast array of war crimes, and it seems to me that Mr. Biden would need to stand up and say so, calling on all nations to condemn Russia's actions and Russia's war crimes. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's one of the first things he ought to be doing.
Yeah, it's like tonight. I mean, you're talking about things like cluster bombing civilian buildings in Kharkiv, right?
Well, I'm talking about intentionally targeting civilians at all.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
apparently there are reports of hospitals being hit. There are many reports out of Kharkiv that say that civilians have been intentionally targeted repeatedly. Those are war crimes. You just can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, are we doing enough? I know Biden, $54 million in humanitarian aid and obviously the economic sanctions, but is that enough? Should we be doing more?
Well, at this point, we're probably doing all we can do, but I don't think we should be sending troops in there. It's hard saying. I admire the Ukrainian people. I admire and I hope for their freedom, but I don't believe we have a vital national security interest there. And you and I have talked many times in the past. You know that I believe we should only intervene on the ground and in the air if we have a vital national security interest at stake. In Ukraine, unfortunately, we do not.
And the question, I want you to get a weigh in on this too, because there's a lot of concurrent talk about China for obvious reasons, and China watching the West and watching what the Biden administration does, and is this going to be a time where they decide to move on Taiwan? And the dynamics, China and Taiwan and Russia and Ukraine, are not exactly parallel, and the disposition of President Xi and his understanding of world history through the lens of the Chinese communist is not exactly the same as Putin's through the Russian communist. But what is your sense of the potential domino effect here if and when Putin is successful in bringing Ukraine under his control?
I don't think there's going to be a domino effect. I think Xi is going to move against Taiwan sometime in the next year and a half, regardless of the outcome in Ukraine. I think that he sees that we are very weak. Mr. Biden is incredibly weak, and it's not going to be something that's going to be restraining Xi at all. I mean, Putin is one thing, Xi is another. The two talk, the two are allied, but I don't think that one is going to have that great an effect on the other.
Mm-hmm.
Don't forget, China has a treaty with Ukraine to protect it from nuclear war. I think that could be tested in the next couple of weeks. I don't think so. And even if it is tested, Ukraine is not going to look for any help from China.
What if Putin, goes nuclear, technically and physically, and releases a nuclear bomb on Ukraine? Then would we get involved with ground troops?
Not with ground troops, but I think we'd be involved in the air. I think, General Mattis once said something effective. If someone uses a tactical nuclear weapon, the choice is not between defeat or suicide. I'm not saying that a nuclear war could be won. I don't think it could be, but I think once the nuclear threshold is crossed, two things. Number one, it's very hard to get back over it again and to the era of restraint. But I do think that it is not a choice between suicide and defeat and surrender.
There-
I think
there's-
there are ways to employ our own tactical nuclear weapons that might make a very great difference to any Russian advance.
Yeah, there's some reporting over the weekend that that Putin didn't exactly lead with his A team in terms of technology and troops. You had some of the Chechen quote unquote hunters that were killed in action. There was a suggestion that it was sort of second and third tier military equipment that was being used in terms of the first wave or two of the incursion. And so he was still sort of holding something back, and I'm not just talking about nuclear weapons, as needed. Is that your sense of it too? Do you think that's accurate?
Well, possibly. I think that there has been an assumption by Russia that they were going to win very quickly, that they didn't need to commit all their forces. I mean, initially, from the information I've seen, they committed about 50% of the ground forces, about 75,000 troops, to the initial waves of the invasion. And now you see a reportedly 30-mile-long armored column moving on Kiev, and there's more coming in to Kharkiv and other areas. I think right now you're seeing the bulk of Russian troops being committed. They're not going to win as fast as they wanted or fast as they fought, but I think it's very heavy odds on them, and that the Ukrainians are going to be defeated at some point.
With respect to U.S. policy, in this administration, and I guess you could skip the Trump and go back to, the Obama-Biden first two presidencies, as this is their third, is the biggest mistake they made with respect to Russia moving away from American energy independence and energy dominance such that we could be providing energy to Western Europe in a more substantial way? Is that the biggest mistake that gives him the underwriting he needs to pursue his revanchist dreams that he's pursuing?
Well, I'm hesitant to label anything the biggest mistake because these guys have made so many enormous blunders, Obama and now Biden, that there's a lot of competition for that title. Mm-hmm. But I would say that's certainly one of the top three or four. Certainly the worst, in my book, is making the Iran nuclear deal with the mullahs in Tehran. I think that is the worst deal that could possibly have been made. And there's a lot of other things that they've made mistakes, Biden and before him, Obama. Again, it's just there's just so many things they've screwed up, guys. I mean, it's just hard to rate each and every one of them.
Well, if President Trump was in office, do you think we'd be in this situation? Or is it hard to tell?
It's hard to tell. I think it's probably true that we'd still be in this situation because Trump, for all the good things he did, he was just too friendly to Putin, and I've never understood that. So, whether there's anything that could be said for Mr. Trump, I think certainly it would be less likely that Putin would be this bold because, frankly, he never knew what Trump would do. Yeah, and frankly, neither did we. But the fact of the matter is, Trump was less predictable, much stronger than Biden, and in some ways we may not have been in this mess had Trump still been president.
He is Jed Babbin, former United States Deputy Undersecretary of Defense and contributor to the Washington Times and the American Spectator. Jed, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is the morning show more Chicago radio listeners are choosing. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Have you ever gone to the grocery store hungry? Big mistake. Next thing you know, you're in your kitchen unloading all these extra items you don't need, saying, "What did I do?" That's kind of like someone who goes into retirement without an income plan. You file for Social Security too early, start pulling